This is Lesson 28.2, the Western Renaissance, or Recovery in Western Europe. What were the sources of post-war recovery and stability in Western Europe? College Board Topic 9.6, Contemporary Western Democracies. Explain the state-based economic developments following World War II and the responses to these developments. Post-war economic growth supported an increase in welfare benefits. However, subsequent economic stagnation led to criticism and limitation of the welfare state. The expansion of cradle-to-grave social welfare programs in the aftermath of World War II, accompanied by high taxes, became a contentious domestic political issue as the budgets of European nations came under pressure in the late 20th century. College Board Topic 9.10, the European Union. Explain how the formation and the existence of the European Union influenced economic developments throughout the period following World War II to the present. European countries began to set aside nationalistic rivalries in favor of economic and political integration, forming a series of transnational unions that grew in size and scope over the second half of the 20th century. As the economic alliance known as the European Coal and Steel Community, envisioned as a means to spur post-war economic recovery, developed into the European Economic Community, the EEC or the Common Market, and the European Union, the EU, Europe experienced increasing economic and political integration and efforts to establish a shared European entity. Also, College Board Topic 9.10, the European Union. Explain how the European Union affected national and European identity throughout the period following World War II to the present. EU member nations continue to balance questions of national sovereignty with the responsibilities of membership in an economic and political union. Place, mostly Western Europe. That's our focus on this lesson. Time frame, roughly 1948 to roughly 1965. Key concepts of the Western Renaissance/recovery: the economic miracle, social market economy, social democratic government, European Economic Community, also known as the Common Market, and Christian Democrats. Key people of the Western Renaissance and recovery: Jean Monnet, John Maynard Keynes, Charles de Gaulle, and Robert Schuman, whose name I may have butchered. Intro. After World War II, the economies and institutions of Europe were in a shambles. But they somehow recovered. Durable institutions were constructed. Economic growth became the greatest in Europe's entire history. It all happened within a generation, and it lasted up to the late 1960s. Like never before, Europe began to see itself as an economic community of nations, rather than as a collection of cutthroat competitors like they had always been. Their relationship before had been fraught with economic competition, nationalism, extreme authoritarianism, competing ideologies, and these things had led to unprecedented death and destruction and 2 world wars, and we've been studying these things all year. Europeans were determined to learn those lessons this time. It was one of those times when Europeans could have given in to their condition and let future generations deal with it, but they didn't. How did they start from practically zero and accomplish such prosperity so quickly? The search for political and social consensus. People and organizations who accomplish great things must do 2 things. Number 1, they have to develop a clear vision for what they want to attain. And number 2, they have to find a pathway toward that vision. And that path is loaded with twists and turns, hidden opportunities, setbacks, and doors that open and close along the way. There was consensus that they didn't want to go back to the kind of economic crises that made people like Hitler and Mussolini possible in the 1930s. They knew that different economic and political policies were going to be in order. And the answer that they settled upon through consensus was a 2-fold combo. Number 1, liberal democracy, and number 2, Keynesian economics. Keynesian economics was named after John Maynard Keynes. According to this, the market is imperfect and not self-sustaining. Equilibrium may include unemployment and negative growth. Consumer income stimulates demand, which causes economic growth. Think of that as the inverse of the trickle-down theory. And when economic growth is lacking, the government should stimulate demand. Again, the inverse of trickle-down theory. So who was John Maynard Keynes? He was a British economist, father of Keynesian theory, author and Cambridge professor, England's Treasury Secretary. He had a seat in the House of Lords. He had a strong following at Harvard, especially after the Great Depression, to which Keynesian theory was a response. He was an imposing figure at 6'6" and a prominent gay figure of his day. He was a successful investor. He turned $500,000 into $13.2 million in 18 years. His book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, explained how government intervention could save a country from widespread unemployment and economic stagnation. He helped rescue the capitalist system from self-destruction and international communism. Keynesian economics analyzes relationships between demand, production, and unemployment, and focuses on government's role in sustaining economic activity. How are you going to stimulate economic growth? It's going to be a creative mix of three things: socialism, free market capitalism, and welfare. An understanding of Keynesian ideas can be helpful in evaluating macroeconomic stability in terms of prices, jobs, and incomes. Keynesians believe that free markets are volatile and not always self-correcting in the event of an external shock. The free market system is prone to lengthy periods of recession and depression. Economies can remain stuck in an underemployment equilibrium. In a world of stagnation or depression, direct state intervention may be essential to restore confidence and lift demand. Keynes was one of the first economists to criticize the profession for adhering to unrealistic assumptions. The socialism part. In this context, socialism means government planning. Many questions had to be collectively considered. What was the government going to protect? What was the government going to own? What was the government going to subsidize? And what was the government going to regulate? And you can imagine the complexity of these issues, particularly as they relate to each other. The second part, free market capitalism. Where must consensus be reached in this area? In what sectors will economic growth be encouraged? What sectors of the economy are going to be privately owned? What sectors are going to be deregulated? And in what sectors will there be competition? And finally, the welfare part. More questions. How generous will this welfare be? Who will receive it? What kinds of benefits will there be? Health, retirement, education, housing, transportation, unemployment? How will you pay for it? What kinds of taxes will you charge people in order to fund it? And when it's all said and done, what are we going to call this economy? It's not a free market, pure capitalism, laissez-faire economy. And it's also not a socialist, totally planned economy. It's a social market economy. And this new type of economy is going to take huge amounts of creativity and planning. The Christian Democrats. Who is going to lead the charge in shaping this new social market economy? Are we going to get the same old leaders with old values and priorities? The Nazis, the communists, some other radical parties? A new type of political party emerged to answer this call. It might have had different names in different countries, and it was going to be rooted in pre-war Catholic parties, such as the Catholic Center Party of Germany, which helped make Bismarck's campaign against the Catholic Church such a failure back in the 1870s. Or the strong conservative Catholic Party in Italy in the 1920s, called the Italian People's Party, which forced Mussolini to compromise with the Catholic Church and kept Mussolini from ever gaining complete control over the country. How do you describe these new Christian Democrats? They are politically just to the right of center. They're against some things. They're anti-communist. They're anti-left wing. They're anti-class politics. they're anti-authoritarian, and they're anti-nationalism. And they are for other things. They're pro-liberalism. They're pro-democracy. Christian Democrat means not necessarily Catholic, not necessarily Protestant, but Christian. Christian Democrats identify and promote the values that both Catholics and Protestants have in common. They also identify and promote a common European heritage. What makes us European? Not what makes us German or French or Italian, etc. What social unit is the backbone of this emerging social consensus? The family. Not the commune, not the collective, not the party, not the union, not the class. So Christian Democrats are going to promote traditional family values. An effective party with an effective, compelling platform is defined by what it's for rather than what it's against. They are pro-cultural and economic cooperation between countries. They're pro-economic growth. They're pro-higher standard of living. They are pro-free market economics. They're pro-consumer goods rather than military goods and things like that. They're pro-social benefits. They're pro-limited government planning. In other words, some government. And in France, Italy, and West Germany, these Christian Democrat parties were being elected to parliamentary power. In Italy, the Christian Democracy Party won an absolute majority in 1948. In France, the Popular Republican Movement, the MRP, won, and they are also Christian Democratic. And in West Germany, the CDU held power from 1949 to 1969. Not every Western European power got on board. Some governments were still way over to the right. Spain, Portugal, and Greece kept their authoritarian regimes until the mid-1970s. Spanish dictator Francisco Franco had to die before Spain began a democracy. Portugal had a right-wing authoritarian state until it was taken over by a left-wing coup in 1974, and we'll talk about that in a couple of lessons. Greece also had an authoritarian monarch until 1975. Some other countries were too significantly to the left of center to buy into this new consensus. These states were called social democratic countries. They included the Scandinavian countries and Great Britain. They gave generous social welfare benefits. They were tolerant of various lifestyles, and they were Cold War neutral. Great Britain also went social democratic, way left of center, with a cradle-to-grave welfare state. The Labour Party took power and led the charge in creating this comprehensive welfare state. Many institutions and industries were nationalized. Banks, iron and steel, utilities, public transportation. There were also lots of cradle-to-grave social benefits, medical, retirement, unemployment, and these were funded by very high taxes. These social democratic programs were so popular among the British that many of them were continued even after the Labour Party lost parliamentary seats to conservative opponents in the 1950s and 1960s. Toward European unity. Since there were these common goals and these common values, how could policymakers take advantage of this European spirit of unity? Is a new European nation on the horizon? Is that what it's going to take to truly rebuild after the war? Rubble was still lying everywhere for years and years after World War II. The Christian Democrats were hoping that they could organize and evolve into a kind of central authority within Europe. Guess who the big holdout was? Great Britain. Now Brexit isn't so much of a surprise. Was a Central European authority what it was going to take for Europe to reassert its position in the world? War would be seemingly unthinkable because of all the economic interdependence. Ironically, the first few steps down the road toward unity was forced upon them by the United States. Even before World War II ended, the U.S. and the European currencies were linked with the Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944, involving 44 countries. It linked Western currencies to the U.S. dollar. It established the International Monetary Fund, and it established the World Bank. And the purpose of these institutions was to facilitate free markets and world trade. Then, in 1948, the Marshall Plan required aid recipient countries to mutually cooperate on lots of infrastructure projects. That was the big thing about the Marshall Plan. It wasn't just about the money. It was the fact that the money was contingent upon all of this mutual cooperation. All this cooperation among European countries needed to somehow be organized and formalized. And this led to the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, the EEOC. And it led to the Council of Europe. And these two organizations were both created in 1948. It seemed as if permanent economic unity was going to be the path toward political unity. But what was going to be the next step down this path? What door was going to open toward political unity? The door opened with an idea in 1950. The idea was the unification of European coal and steel production. Two French statesmen, Jean Monnet and Robert Schuman, said, "Let's have a permanent international organization to control just these two industries, coal and steel." The Christian democratic governments of France, West Germany, Italy, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, that's 6, all joined. Great Britain, a social democratic government, didn't join. These 6 formed the European Steel and Coal Community in 1951. They created a common market for coal and steel in Europe. Members were to have no national tariffs on one another. There were to be no competing national production quotas. Quotas tend to flood the market with too much product and drive down prices for everyone. The European Steel and Coal Community functioned so successfully that in 1957 these 6 countries got together and signed the Treaty of Rome. And this treaty created the European Economic Community, the EEC. And this was also known as the Common Market. The main idea was to create a huge single market that would compete with the U.S. The Common Market had several goals: gradual reduction of all tariffs, free movement of capital and labor, common economic policies and institutions, increased trade within the Common Market, increased exports, shared resources for modernization. It looked like these 6 countries were on their way toward creating a politically unified European nation. As we have seen over and over, nationalism is extremely powerful, and it dies slowly. Charles de Gaulle was the president of France. He was a genuine World War II hero. He was reelected into office in 1958, 1 year after the Treaty of Rome was signed in 1957. And Charles de Gaulle was a serious nationalist. Charles de Gaulle saw the U.S. as a threat to French and European independence. Charles de Gaulle withdrew all French military forces from NATO. He developed France's own nuclear weapons, and he vetoed the idea of turning the common market into a majority rule body. Another consumer revolution. By the late 1950s, there was a shift in how Europeans spent their money. Before, a high percentage of spending was on housing and food, in other words, necessities. But this spending was gradually replaced by higher spending on consumer goods. This was facilitated by high government employment and higher wages. Examples of goods that are not necessities: appliances like washing machines, entertainment like TVs, record players, and radios, cars. There were 5 million cars in Europe in 1948, and there were 44 million in 1965. Consumer goods were an important measure for economic growth. Credit expanded. You don't buy expensive things if you have serious doubts about whether you can pay it back. Banks won't give you credit if they have such doubts. But this new prosperity gave more confidence to both sides of the credit equation. This was mostly due to the expansion of Social Security safeguards. You don't have to save money for a rainy day as much. All of this consumer abundance makes great propaganda ammo in the Cold War fight against communism. Politicians on both sides of the Iron Curtain were claiming that their systems provide more. But you could not argue with more goods of all kinds on the store shelves. Totally planned economies simply could not keep up with this social market economy.